Some land doesn't wait to be found. It waits for the right soul to hear it first. The wind rolled low across the empty fields outside a forgotten Midwest town, carrying the dry whisper of late autumn through rows of brittle corn stalks that hadn't been harvested in years. And standing right at the edge of that silence was a 6-year-old German shepherd named Rex, completely still, his amber eyes locked on a patch of ground no wider than a pickup truck, his ears tilted forward as if listening to something too deep for human ears, and beside him, Ethan Cole shifted his weight. With a tired sigh, the gravel crunching under his worn boots, a man who had seen too many places and belonged to none, his jacket faded, his hands rough, his eyes carrying the quiet distance of someone who had stopped expecting anything from the world. He followed Rex's gaze, but saw nothing except empty land stretching out under a pale gray sky, the kind of sky that made time feel slower, heavier, like it was holding its breath. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice low, almost careful not to disturb whatever silence had settled there. But Rex didn't move, didn't blink, just let out a slow, uneasy breath through his nose, and then, without warning, his body tensed, a subtle shift that Ethan had learned to trust more than any instinct of his own, because Rex had been right before. In places where being wrong cost too much, the air changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that Ethan felt it in his chest before he heard anything at all, a faint sound carried under the wind. Something distant, strained, almost swallowed by the wide open space. And then it came again, clearer this time. A human voice calling out from somewhere beyond the rise of the field. Ethan's posture straightened instantly, that old discipline returning like it had never left. "Stay close," he said, already moving forward, his pace quick but controlled, eyes scanning the land as Rex surged ahead, not running wildly, but with purpose, cutting a direct line toward the sound like he already knew where it was coming from. The ground dipped slightly beyond the ridge, revealing a stretch of farmland broken by an overturned tractor lying at an angle near a shallow ditch, its metal frame catching the dull light, and next to it, a man, older, worn by years of labor, pinned awkwardly but still conscious, his breaths uneven as he tried to call out again. And in that moment, everything else faded. The wind, the silence, the weight of Ethan's past. It all slipped away, replaced by a single, steady focus. He moved in without hesitation, dropping to his knees beside the man, his hands already working, steady, practiced, not rushed but precise, while Rex circled once and then planted himself firmly nearby, alert, watchful, as if guarding something more than just the moment. And as Ethan helped ease the man free, the stranger's trembling voice broke through the tension. "I thought no one would hear me out here," he said, his eyes searching Ethan's face with something deeper than relief, something closer to recognition. And for a brief second, as the wind shifted again across that quiet land, Ethan had the strange feeling that it wasn't just a rescue, not just chance, but something older, quieter, something that had been waiting long before either of them arrived. Because sometimes, the earth doesn't call out to everyone, only to the ones who are meant to listen. The man's name was Walter Hayes, and even as his breathing slowly steadied, his eyes never left Ethan's face, as though he was trying to place him somewhere beyond that field, beyond that moment, like a memory half remembered, the kind that lingers just out of reach. And when Ethan finally helped him sit upright against the cool metal of the tractor, Walter let out a long breath that seemed to carry years with it, the kind of breath a man releases when he realizes he has been given time he did not expect to keep. "You came from the road?" Walter asked, his voice rough but steady, and Ethan nodded once, brushing the dust from his hands, passing through. He replied simply, as if that explained everything, and in a way, it did, because men like him were always passing through somewhere, never staying long enough for roots to take hold, never asking for more than a place to rest and a reason to keep moving. Rex stepped closer. Then, his nose low to the ground, circling not the tractor, not the man, but the stretch of land just beyond them, his paws pressing into the soil with careful intent, his ears twitching at something faint and distant. And Walter noticed, his brow furrowing slightly as he followed the dog's movement. "That dog of yours," he said quietly. "He acts like he hears things most folks do not." Ethan glanced over. Watching Rex pause again at the same invisible line. He usually does, he answered, and there was no pride in his voice, only quiet certainty, the kind built from experience that did not need explaining. The wind shifted then, rolling across the open acres, bending what little grass remained and carrying with it a faint, almost metallic scent that did not belong to crops or earth or anything that should have been there. Walter's gaze drifted across the field, slower this time, more thoughtful, as if something old had been stirred awake inside him. Strange thing about this land, he murmured, almost to himself. It has always had its moods. Ethan did not respond right away, but something in the way Walter said it made the words settle heavier than they should have, like they carried more truth than explanation. After a moment, Walter pushed himself to his feet with Ethan's help, steady but cautious, and looked out over the acres that stretched farther than the eye could measure. "You saved my life out here," he said, turning back with a faint, weathered smile. "Least I can do is offer you a place to stay the night, maybe longer if you need it." Ethan hesitated, not out of distrust, but out of habit, because staying had never come easily to him. But before he could answer, Rex gave a low, quiet sound, not quite a bark, not quite a growl, something in between, and both men turned to see him standing again at that same patch of ground, unmoving, focused, as if the earth itself had called his name. And for a brief second, the field fell into a deeper silence, one that felt less like emptiness and more like something waiting just beneath the surface. Walter exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing with something that was not quite fear, not quite recognition, but something closer to both. "He keeps going back to that spot," he said, more to himself than to Ethan. "Has not happened in years." Ethan stepped closer, his boots pressing into the soil beside Rex, and though he saw nothing different, felt nothing unusual, there was a subtle sense that the ground beneath him held more than it revealed, something quiet, something patient, something that had not been disturbed in a very long time. And as the sun dipped lower behind the distant tree line, casting long shadows across the land, Walter spoke again, softer now, almost like a confession carried on the wind. "My father used to say some parts of this land do not belong to us." He paused, glancing once more at Rex, then at Ethan. "They just wait for the right person to come along." And for reasons Ethan could not explain, those words did not feel like a story. They felt like the beginning of something that had already been set in motion long before he ever stepped foot on that road. The farmhouse sat at the far edge of the land, weathered wood softened by years of wind and sun, its porch leaning just slightly as if it had learned to rest instead of resist. And as Ethan followed Walter up the narrow dirt path, the quiet stretched around them in a way that felt heavier than simple silence. Rex stayed close at first, his steps measured, but every few yards he would pause and glance back toward the field, toward that same unseen point, his ears twitching as though the ground behind them was still speaking. Walter noticed it again, but said nothing this time, only tightened his grip slightly on the railing as he climbed the 2 wooden steps. The door creaked open with a familiar sound, one that carried the scent of old timber, dust, and something faintly sweet, like dried hay left too long in the sun. Inside, the house was simple, a single wide room opening into a kitchen that looked untouched by time, a kettle resting on the stove, a chair pulled slightly away from the table as if someone had stood up and never returned. Ethan stepped in slowly, his boots quiet against the worn floorboards, and for a moment, he just stood there, letting the stillness settle over him. It was not uncomfortable, not empty, just waiting. Walter moved to the window, his gaze drifting back toward the fields now painted gold by the fading light. "Been here near 40 years, he said softly, his voice carrying a kind of distance that did not come from space, but from memory. "My father worked this land before me, and his father before him." He paused, resting his hand on the frame. "But there are parts of it they never touched." Ethan glanced over, leaning his shoulder lightly against the doorway. "Never needed to?" he asked, and Walter gave a small, quiet smile, the kind that did not quite reach his eyes. "That is what they told themselves," he said. "But truth is they were not sure they were supposed to." The room fell silent again, but not empty, not hollow, more like something listening from just beyond the edges of the walls. Rex moved past them then, slow and deliberate, his nails tapping softly against the wood as he made his way through the house, sniffing corners. Pausing at the base of a narrow hallway that led toward the back, he stood there longer this time, his body still, his head tilted slightly as if aligning himself with something only he could sense. Ethan watched him, the same quiet tension returning to his chest, that familiar feeling he had learned not to ignore. "He does not like something," Walter said, his voice lower now, almost cautious, but Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he replied, eyes still on Rex. "He is not afraid." Rex let out a soft breath, then turned his head slowly, not toward the hallway, not toward the door, but downward, toward the floor beneath his paws. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to hold still, the air, the light, even the faint creak of the house settling into the evening. Walter stepped closer, his expression tightening as he followed the dog's gaze. "That spot," he whispered, more to himself than to Ethan, "has not made a sound in years." Ethan frowned slightly. "A sound?" Walter nodded, his eyes fixed now, his voice quieter than before. "At night, when the wind is just right, you can hear something beneath the floorboards." He hesitated, as if choosing whether to say more, then finally exhaled. "My father used to say the land does not forget what was built under it." The words hung in the air, heavy but calm, and as the last light of day slipped through the window and faded across the worn wooden floor, Rex slowly lowered himself down onto that exact spot, his body relaxed but his eyes still open, watching, waiting, as if whatever lay beneath them had finally begun to stir again. And for the first time since stepping into that house, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not doubt, but a quiet certainty that this place had been expecting them long before they ever arrived. The night settled slowly over the farmhouse, not with darkness alone, but with a kind of quiet that seemed to press gently against the walls. And Ethan lay awake on the narrow cot Walter had offered, his eyes fixed on the ceiling where faint shadows moved with the shifting branches outside. The air carried the soft scent of wood and earth, familiar in a way that felt distant, like something remembered from a life he no longer lived. Across the room, Rex remained exactly where he had been, stretched over that same patch of floor, his body still but his ears alert, rising and falling with sounds too subtle for human hearing. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, listening. At first there was nothing but the wind brushing against the siding, a slow, steady rhythm. But then, beneath it, something else, faint and measured, not quite a sound, more like a vibration traveling through the wood beneath him. He opened his eyes again, the feeling settling deeper now, not fear, not danger, just presence, like the house itself was breathing in long, quiet intervals, every few seconds. The boards beneath the floor gave the slightest shift, almost too small to notice, but steady enough to form a pattern. Ethan turned his head toward Rex, the dog's gaze already fixed on him, as if waiting for him to finally understand. "You hear it too?" Ethan whispered, though he already knew the answer. Rex let out a low breath, his tail moving once against the floor, not restless, not anxious, just certain. Ethan sat up slowly, placing his boots on the ground. The wood felt solid, unchanged, and yet something beneath it carried a rhythm that did not belong to the house. He stood, taking a step toward Rex, and the moment his weight shifted over that exact spot, the sensation became clearer, not louder, but more defined, like something responding to his presence. He knelt down, pressing his palm flat against the floorboards, and there it was, a steady pulse, subtle but undeniable, spaced evenly, like a slow heartbeat buried beneath layers of time and soil. His breath caught for a moment, not in alarm, but in recognition of something he could not yet explain. From the doorway, Walter's voice broke the silence, low and awake. "You feel it now," he said, not asking, not surprised, just stating what he already knew. Ethan looked up, his hand still resting against the wood. "It is not wind," he said quietly. Walter stepped closer, his face half-shadowed in the dim light, his expression carrying a weight that had been there long before this night. "No," he replied. "It never was." He leaned against the frame, his gaze fixed on the same spot. "My father heard it once, years back, said it came every 20 or 30 seconds, always the same, like something counting time beneath the ground." Ethan listened again, counting without meaning to, 1, 2, 3. And then there it was, the next faint pulse, steady, patient, unchanged. Rex shifted slightly, pressing his palm more firmly against the floor, as if marking the exact center of it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his thoughts moving through possibilities he could not quite hold on to. Why did it stop? He asked. Walter's eyes lowered, his voice quieter now, almost careful. It did not stop, he said. We just stopped listening. The words settled deep in the room, and for a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only thing that remained was that quiet, repeating rhythm beneath them, steady as breath, older than the house, older than memory. And as Ethan rested his hand once more against the wood, he felt something shift, not in the floor, not in the sound, but in himself, a sense that whatever lay beneath was no longer hidden by accident, but revealed by timing, as if it had waited through years of silence for someone who would finally stay long enough to hear it again. Morning did not arrive with light so much as it arrived with awareness, a pale gray glow stretching slowly across the fields as if the land itself was waking in layers, and Ethan stood on the porch with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold in his hand, his eyes fixed on the wide stretch of earth beyond the barn where the wind moved in long, low waves. Rex stood beside him, silent, his posture calm but attentive, his gaze locked on that same unseen line that had held his focus since the day before. Walter stepped out a moment later, slower now, his movements careful but steady, and for a while, none of them spoke, the kind of silence that did not demand to be filled, only understood. It always feels different in the morning, Walter said at last, his voice quiet but certain. Ethan glanced toward him. Different how? He asked. Walter exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the field, like it is waiting to see who is still listening. The words settled between them, not strange, not dramatic, just honest in a way that did not need explanation. Rex shifted then, stepping down from the porch and moving across the yard with a purpose that was no longer uncertain. Ethan followed without being told, his boots pressing into the dry soil as he walked. The distance from the house to that spot did not feel far, but it carried a weight now, like crossing into something unspoken. When they reached it, Rex stopped immediately, placing both front paws firmly on the ground, his body still, his ears slightly forward. Ethan crouched beside him, brushing his hand across the surface. The dirt looked ordinary, compact, untouched by anything recent, but the moment his palm rested flat against it, the sensation returned, faint but steady, that same slow pulse, measured and consistent, as if whatever lay beneath the ground was still marking time. Walter stood a few steps back, watching, his expression unreadable, for a moment before something softer moved through it, something like acceptance. There used to be markers here, he said. Ethan looked up. Markers? Walter nodded. Wooden posts, old ones, long gone now. My father pulled them out when he took over the land, said they did not belong anymore. He paused, his gaze drifting across the empty stretch. But he never plowed this section, never built on it, not once. Ethan stood slowly, glancing between Walter and the ground. Because of this? He asked. Walter gave a small nod. Because of what he could not explain. The wind shifted again, carrying that same faint metallic trace through the air, and Rex moved suddenly, not frantic, not uncertain, but direct, stepping 2 feet to the left and beginning to dig, his paws moving with controlled urgency, not scattering dirt wildly but clearing it, layer by layer, as if he knew exactly where to stop. Ethan watched closely, his breath steady, his mind quieting as he focused on the motion. After only a few inches, the sound changed, the soft scrape of dirt giving way to something harder beneath. Rex paused, stepping back just enough for Ethan to see, and there, just beneath the surface, was a flat edge, darkened by time but unmistakably man-made. Ethan knelt immediately, brushing away the remaining dirt with careful hands, revealing more of it, a surface not natural to the land, smooth, solid, and set with intention. Walter stepped closer now, his breath catching slightly. It is still there, he murmured, not surprised, not shocked, just certain. Ethan looked up at him. What is it? He asked. Walter hesitated, just for a second, before answering, his voice lower now, like something meant only for the two of them. My father never told me exactly, he said. only that whatever was buried here was not meant for just anyone to find. The words lingered in the air as the morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the land. And as Ethan placed his hand once more against that hidden surface, feeling the faint echo of that same steady rhythm beneath it, he realized something had already changed. Not just the land, not just the moment, but the path that had brought him here. Because some discoveries do not begin when you uncover them. They begin the moment something chooses to be found. They did not speak much after that. Because some moments do not need words. They need time. And Ethan spent the next hour clearing the rest of the soil from the surface, working slowly, carefully, as if whatever lay beneath deserved patience rather than force. The dirt gave way inch by inch until the shape became clear, a rectangular steel hatch, weathered by decades but still intact, its edges sealed tight against the earth as though it had been meant to stay hidden. The metal carried a dull gray tone, faintly marked by lines that suggested it had been placed with precision, not abandoned, not forgotten, but deliberately concealed. Rex stayed close the entire time, pacing once, then settling near the edge, his eyes never leaving the hatch, his ears reacting to something deeper than sound. Walter stood a few feet back, his hands resting at his sides, his breathing slower now, more measured, like a man who had spent years avoiding a truth that had finally risen to the surface. "I have walked over this spot my whole life," he said quietly, more to himself than to Ethan, "and I never once thought to dig." Ethan brushed the last layer of dust away, revealing a rusted handle embedded into the metal. It was old, but not broken, still strong enough to serve its purpose. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the cold weight of something that had outlasted time. "Your father knew," Ethan said without looking up. Walter nodded slowly. "He knew enough to stay away," he replied, "and enough to wait." The wind passed over them again, softer now, carrying with it that same faint trace in the air, something metallic, something aged. Ethan stood, wiping his hands against his jeans, his eyes fixed on the hatch. There was no urgency in his movements, no rush to open it, just a quiet understanding that whatever this was, it had not waited all these years to be forced open in haste. Rex stepped closer, placing one paw lightly against the edge, then looking up at Ethan with a calm, steady gaze. Not warning, not fear, but something closer to permission. Ethan exhaled slowly, reaching down and gripping the handle. The metal felt heavier than it looked, grounded, anchored, and for a brief second, he paused, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the moment itself. Walter took a step forward, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "If it opens," he said, "then it was meant to." Ethan nodded once, and then, with steady hands, he pulled. At first, nothing moved, the seal of years holding firm. But then, slowly, with a low, quiet shift, the hatch gave way, the sound not loud, not dramatic, just a soft release, like something finally exhaling after a long silence. The edge lifted, revealing darkness beneath, not empty, not hollow, but deep, the kind of darkness that held space rather than absence. A faint breath of cool air rose from below, carrying with it the scent of earth untouched by time. And something else, something older, something preserved. Rex leaned forward slightly, his nose catching the air, his posture steady, unafraid. Ethan held the hatch open, his gaze fixed on what lay beneath, though the light from above barely reached inside. He could see the outline of something structured, not natural. Walls, steps, a passage descending into the ground with intention. Walter moved beside him now, his eyes widening just enough to reveal the truth he had carried for years without ever seeing it. "It is still there," he whispered again. But this time the words held something different. Not memory, not doubt, but realization. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his hand resting against the cold metal, his mind quiet, not racing ahead, not pulling back, simply present. Because some doors do not open to what is hidden, they open to what has been waiting. And as he looked down into that silent space beneath the land, he understood one thing clearly. Whatever had been placed there was never lost. It had simply been waiting for someone who would finally choose to look beneath the surface instead of walking past it. The opening did not invite them in. It waited, and for a long moment none of them moved. as if stepping forward too quickly might disturb something that had held its place beneath the earth for longer than memory could reach. Ethan adjusted his grip on the edge of the hatch, letting it rest open as he leaned slightly closer, his eyes tracing the outline of the narrow stairway that descended into the ground. Each step, cut with purpose, not crude, not rushed, but measured, the kind of structure built by someone who expected it to last. The air rising from below remained cool and steady, carrying that same faint metallic trace, mixed now with the scent of aged wood and something older, something preserved by time rather than erased by it. Rex stepped forward first, his paws landing quietly at the edge, his body lowering slightly as he studied the darkness, his ears shifting, listening, not for movement, not for danger, but for something that felt almost familiar to him. Ethan watched closely, his trust in the dog guiding him more than any instinct of his own. "Easy," he said softly. Though his voice carried calm rather than caution, Rex turned his head once, meeting Ethan's gaze, then without hesitation placed one paw onto the first step, testing it, steady, and then the next, moving slowly but without fear. As if he already understood what lay beneath them, Walter remained just behind, his breath quieter now, his eyes fixed on the opening, not with fear, but with the weight of something long avoided finally standing in front of him. "No one has ever gone down there," he said, his voice barely above the wind. Ethan glanced back briefly. "Not even your father?" Walter shook his head once. "He said some doors are not locked to keep people out," he replied. "They are left closed so only the right ones will open them." The words settled into Ethan's thoughts as he stepped forward, placing his foot onto the first step. The wood held firm beneath his weight, solid despite the years, the structure beneath the land not weakened but preserved. He moved carefully, one step at a time, following Rex as the light from above stretched down behind them, fading. Slowly with each foot they descended. The air grew cooler, quieter, the outside world retreating until only the sound of their own movement remained, soft, measured, deliberate. After several steps, Ethan reached out, his hand brushing along the wall beside him. It was not dirt, not stone, but wood reinforced with metal supports, smooth in places, worn in others, but still intact, still strong. A passage built with intention, not temporary, not hidden in haste, but designed to remain. Rex paused a few steps ahead, his body still, his head tilted slightly as he listened again, and in that silence, Ethan felt it once more, not through his feet this time, but through the air itself, that same steady rhythm, faint but present, echoing from somewhere deeper below, not loud, not threatening, just constant, as if something far beneath them was still keeping time. He exhaled slowly, the sound grounding him in the moment, and continued downward, the staircase opening into a wider space just ahead, where the ceiling lifted slightly and the darkness began to take shape. Outlines forming where the light touched, wooden beams, reinforced walls, a structure that extended beyond what should have existed beneath a simple field. Walter finally stepped down behind them, slower but steady, his hand brushing along the wall, as if confirming it was real. "This was built to last," he murmured, his voice carrying a quiet disbelief. Ethan did not answer right away, his focus drawn forward, deeper into the space where something unseen seemed to pull the air inward, a presence not defined by sight but by feeling, as if the land above had been only a surface, and what truly mattered had always been hidden beneath it, waiting in silence for footsteps that would finally descend. And as Rex moved again, leading them forward without hesitation, Ethan understood that this was no longer about discovery, it was about continuation. Because whatever had been placed here was not abandoned, it was preserved, and whatever waited below had not been forgotten. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to follow the path all the way down. The space at the base of the stairs opened wider than Ethan expected, not like a cellar or a storage pit, but like something designed with purpose, with thought, with a sense that whoever built it understood time in a way most people did not. The ceiling rose just enough to stand upright, supported by thick wooden beams reinforced with iron brackets that had aged but not weakened. The air remained cool and still, untouched by the changing seasons above, and yet it did not feel abandoned. It felt maintained, as if the years had passed around it rather than through it. Rex stepped forward into the room, his paws quiet against the solid floor, his body relaxed now but focused, his nose lifting slightly as he traced the air, not searching, but recognizing. Ethan followed a step behind, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light filtering down from above. Shapes forming where shadows had once been. Along the walls stood shelves, not empty, but filled with objects carefully placed. Jars sealed with metal lids, tools arranged in rows, boxes stacked with precision, nothing scattered, nothing left carelessly, everything exactly where it had been meant to stay. Walter reached the bottom of the stairs last, his hand still brushing the wall, as if grounding himself in something real. His gaze moved slowly across the room, not with confusion, but with a quiet, growing understanding. This was not hidden in fear, he said, his voice low but steady. It was hidden with intention. Ethan stepped closer to one of the shelves, running his fingers lightly across the surface of a wooden crate. The dust was thin, barely there, as if the air itself had kept things preserved. He lifted the edge of a lid just enough to see inside. Old documents, neatly stacked, edges yellowed but intact, bound together with twine that had not rotted. Time had passed here, but it had not taken anything away. Rex moved further into the room, stopping near the far wall where the structure seemed to extend deeper. His ears flicked once, then again, and Ethan felt it before he heard it. That same steady rhythm, faint but present, echoing now through the enclosed space, not from the floor above, but from somewhere ahead, something deeper, something still hidden even here. Walter stepped closer, his breath slower now, more controlled, his eyes following Rex. "There is more," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization. Ethan nodded once, his focus narrowing as he looked toward the far end of the room, where a second doorway stood, partially concealed by shadow, its frame reinforced, its presence unmistakable now that he knew where to look. The rhythm seemed to pull from beyond it. Steady, patient, unchanged, Rex walked toward it without hesitation, his steps measured, his posture calm, as if he had already accepted whatever waited on the other side. Ethan followed, his hand brushing lightly against the wall as he moved, feeling the strength of it, the permanence, the intention behind every beam and every support. Walter remained just a step behind, his expression no longer uncertain, but resolved, as if the years of not knowing had finally led him to this exact moment. And as they reached the doorway, the air shifted slightly, cooler, deeper, carrying with it that same metallic trace, stronger now, more defined. Ethan paused at the threshold, not out of fear, but out of recognition that this was not just a place. It was a continuation of something built long before him. Rex stepped through first, disappearing into the shadow beyond, and after a brief moment, Ethan followed. Because some paths do not ask if you are ready, they only ask if you are willing to. Keep going once you have already begun. The second passage did not open into another storage space. It opened into something that felt purposeful in a way Ethan could not immediately name. The walls narrowed slightly before widening again into a long chamber that stretched deeper beneath the land. And as his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he realized this place had not only been built to last, it had been built to be used. Along one side ran a series of metal conduits, aged but intact, fixed carefully along the walls as if they once carried something important, while on the other side stood a row of reinforced cabinets, each one sealed, each one labeled with markings that had faded but not disappeared. Rex moved slowly through the center of the space, his steps measured, his posture calm, his ears turning slightly with each faint echo of that steady rhythm that now felt closer, clearer, as though whatever produced it was just beyond reach. Ethan followed, his gaze moving across every detail, taking in the precision, the care, the intention behind every inch of the structure. Nothing here had been rushed, nothing had been left incomplete. Walter stepped in behind him, his breath catching just slightly as he took in the sight. "This is not just a hiding place," he said quietly, and Ethan nodded. "No," he replied. "This was meant to be found by someone who knew how to see it." Rex paused near one of the cabinets, lowering his head as if drawn by something specific. Ethan stepped beside him and reached out, placing his hand against the metal surface. It was cool, steady, untouched by time in a way that felt unnatural. He found the handle, hesitated only briefly, then pulled it open. Inside, neatly arranged, were documents sealed in protective sleeves, maps layered one beneath the other, each one marked with coordinates, boundaries, and symbols that extended far beyond the farmland above. Ethan lifted one carefully, unfolding it just enough to see the scope of it. The lines stretched outward, connecting the land they stood on to areas miles away, forming a pattern that was too precise to be coincidence. Walter leaned closer, his eyes widening as he traced the markings. With his gaze, this land was part of something larger, he whispered, and Ethan nodded slowly. Something planned, he added, his voice low, thoughtful. Rex let out a soft sound then, turning his head toward the far end of the chamber, where the rhythm now felt strongest, almost present in the air itself, steady, patient, unchanged. Ethan folded the map carefully and set it back in place, his focus shifting forward. The chamber extended another 20 feet before narrowing again into a final section, partially concealed by a reinforced door that stood slightly ajar, the edges worn but the structure solid, as if it had been opened once and never fully closed again. The air beyond it carried that same metallic scent, stronger now, mixed with something else, something older, something preserved with care. Rex moved toward it without hesitation, his body lowering slightly as he approached, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Ethan followed, his steps quiet but steady, his mind no longer searching for explanations, only for understanding. Walter came last, slower but certain, as if whatever lay ahead was something he had always known existed but had never been meant to see alone. And as Ethan reached the door, placing his hand against its surface, he felt it again, not just the faint pulse, but the presence behind it, something steady, something waiting, something that had not been disturbed in decades but had never truly been silent. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges moving with a low, controlled sound, revealing a final chamber beyond. And in that moment, as the darkness gave way to shape and form, Ethan understood that this was not just the end of what had been hidden. It was the beginning of why it had been hidden in the first place. Because some secrets are not buried to be forgotten. They are buried to be discovered by the ones who are ready to carry them forward. The final chamber did not feel like the end of something. It felt like the center, the place everything else had been built to protect. And as the door opened fully, the faint light from above reached just far enough to reveal the shape of what stood inside, a structure placed at the heart of the room, not large, not overwhelming, but deliberate, a sealed unit made of reinforced metal and thick glass panels, its surface aged but intact, its presence commanding not through size but through purpose. The steady rhythm they had followed now felt stronger here, not louder, but clearer, as if the space itself carried it, echoing gently through the air like something alive but patient. Rex stepped forward slowly, his body lowering slightly as he approached, his movements calm, his breathing steady, his ears shifting with each pulse that passed through the chamber. Ethan followed a step behind, his eyes fixed on the structure, his mind quiet, no longer searching for explanation but ready to understand. Walter remained near the doorway for a moment, his hand resting against the frame, as if he needed to anchor himself before stepping further, then finally moved closer, his gaze locked on what stood before them. "This is what it was all for," he said softly, and Ethan did not answer, because there was nothing to add. The truth was already there, waiting to be seen. The structure had a panel along its front, partially transparent, allowing just enough view inside to reveal what had been preserved. Rows of carefully arranged components, documents sealed in protective layers, and at the center, a device unlike anything Ethan had seen before, not complex in appearance, but precise, its form built around a core that emitted the faintest glow, not bright, not artificial, but steady, like something that had been designed to endure rather than impress. The rhythm came from it, not mechanical in the usual sense, but consistent, measured, every 27 seconds, a subtle pulse moved through the core, traveling outward in a way that could be felt more than heard. Ethan stepped closer, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, his hand lifting instinctively, but stopping just short of touching it, not out of fear, but out of respect for something he did not yet fully understand. Rex stood at his side, unmoving now, his attention fixed, not restless, not uncertain, but certain in a way only instinct could explain. Walter moved closer as well, his breath slow, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the device. My father used to say the land had a heart, he murmured, something buried deep that kept everything alive in its own way. Ethan glanced at him briefly, then back to the structure. Maybe he was not speaking in metaphor. He said quietly, the air in the chamber felt different here, not heavy, not cold, but steady, like standing inside a moment that had been preserved across time. The documents surrounding the device carried markings, diagrams, records of something planned, something maintained, something that had been left behind not as a secret, but as a responsibility. Ethan's gaze moved across them, understanding forming slowly. This was not just a hidden chamber, it was a system, a network, something connected to the land above in ways that could not be seen from the surface. Walter stepped closer still, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the structure. His voice quieter now, almost reflective. This was never mine, he said, not with regret, but with clarity. Ethan did not respond right away, his focus still on the steady pulse, the quiet rhythm that had guided them here from the very beginning. And in that moment, something settled inside him. Not a realization spoken in words, but a feeling that carried more weight than explanation. Because some things are not discovered to be owned, they are discovered to be understood. And as the faint pulse moved through the chamber once more, steady and unchanged, Ethan understood that what they had found was not the end of a mystery. It was the beginning of a choice, one that had been waiting far longer than either of them had known. For a long moment, no one moved. Because the quiet inside that chamber was not empty. It was full of meaning that had taken years to arrive at this exact point. And Ethan stood there with his hand still suspended just inches from the glass, feeling the steady rhythm move through the air like a breath that did not belong to any one person, but to something far older, something designed to continue whether anyone was there to witness it or not. Rex shifted slightly beside him, not stepping away, not moving closer, just holding his position with a calm certainty that seemed to anchor the entire space, as if his presence alone confirmed that nothing here was wrong, nothing here was out of place. Walter exhaled slowly behind them, his shoulders lowering as if a weight he had carried for decades had finally found somewhere to rest. My father kept a journal, he said quietly, his voice carrying a tone that felt both distant and immediate. He wrote about this place without ever naming it, always in pieces, like he was afraid that saying too much would change something. Ethan turned his head slightly, listening, while still keeping his gaze on the structure. He said there was a system beneath the land. Walter continued. Something built long before he took over, something meant to protect more than just crops or soil. The words settled into the air, fitting too easily with everything they had seen. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, stepping back just enough to take in the entire chamber again. The shelves, the documents, the structure at the center, it all aligned now, not as fragments, but as parts of a single purpose. This was never about hiding, Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to Walter. It was about waiting. Rex let out a soft breath, his ears flicking once as the pulse moved through the space again. Steady, unchanged. Walter stepped closer to the structure, his reflection faint in the glass. Then why now? He asked, not with doubt, but with a quiet need to understand. Ethan did not answer immediately, because the answer was not something that could be explained with logic alone. It was something felt, something recognized in the way events had unfolded, in the way Rex had stopped at that exact spot, in the way the hatch had opened, in the way everything had led them here without force or coincidence. He looked down briefly at Rex, then back at the structure. Because something needed to be seen again, he said at last. Walter nodded slowly, his eyes softening as the truth settled in, not as a surprise, but as something that had been waiting for him to accept it. He stepped back, giving Ethan space without needing to say it. Because some decisions are not given, they are recognized. The room remained still around them, the steady pulse continuing without interruption, not demanding attention, not asking for anything, simply existing. And in that quiet, Ethan felt something shift inside him, not a burden, not a responsibility forced upon him, but a sense of alignment, like a path he had not known he was walking had finally reached a place where it made sense to stop. to stand still, to listen. He took a slow breath, letting the air settle in his chest, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was passing through. He felt like he had arrived somewhere that had been expecting him, not for what he had done, but for what he was willing to become. And as the faint pulse moved through the chamber once more, steady and patient, Ethan understood that whatever this place was meant to protect, it had already begun to choose who would protect it next. Walter did not speak for a long time after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because some truths take shape in silence before they can ever become words. And he stood there in that chamber, looking not just at the structure in front of him, but at the years behind him, the land he had walked every day, the soil he had trusted, the quiet instincts he had learned to ignore, and now all of it seemed to gather into a single understanding that felt both heavy and strangely relieving. He took a slow breath and stepped back, giving Ethan a clear space in front of the structure, not as a gesture of distance, but as an acknowledgement. This was never mine to keep, he said quietly, his voice steady, not regretful, not uncertain, just clear. Ethan turned slightly, his eyes meeting Walter's, and there was no surprise in his expression, only recognition, because somewhere along the way, he had already begun to feel it, not as a claim, not as ownership, but as alignment. Rex shifted beside him, his posture calm, his presence unwavering, as if confirming what neither man needed to say out loud. Walter continued, his voice carrying the weight of something passed down without explanation. My father stayed because he believed someone would come one day, someone who would not just find this place, but understand it. He paused, letting the words settle, then added softly, I think he was waiting for you. Ethan did not answer immediately, because the moment did not ask for quick acceptance. It asked for honesty. He looked back at the structure, at the steady pulse that had guided them from the surface to this exact point, and then at the shelves, the maps, the system that extended beyond what they could see. This was not just land, it was a responsibility, shaped by time and intention, something that required more than presence. It required care. Walter reached into his jacket then, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, and when he pulled it out, he held a small, worn object, a key, old but well kept, its metal surface marked by years but not weakened. He stepped forward and placed it gently into Ethan's hand, the weight of it simple, but meaningful in a way that went beyond the object itself. This opens the outer gates to the lower sections, he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. I never used it, never felt like it was meant for me. Ethan looked down at the key, then back at Walter, understanding passing between them without needing explanation. Rex moved closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him in the moment. The steady pulse echoed once more through the chamber, unchanged, patient, as if acknowledging the shift that had just taken place. Walter stepped back again, his shoulders relaxing in a way that suggested something long held had finally been released. The land is yours now, he said, not as a transaction, not as a gift given lightly, but as a truth recognized at the right time. Ethan closed his hand gently around the key, not gripping it tightly, but holding it with care, and for the first time, the idea of staying did not feel like hesitation. It felt like direction. He looked around the chamber once more, taking in the quiet strength of it, the steady rhythm that had never stopped, the system that had waited through years without losing its purpose. And then he nodded, not in agreement with Walter, but in acceptance of something deeper, something that had already begun before he ever stepped onto that road. Because some inheritances are not given through words, they are revealed through moments that cannot be ignored. And as the pulse moved through the chamber again, steady and sure, Ethan understood that this place had not simply been waiting to be found. It had been waiting for someone willing to remain. They did not rush to leave the chamber, because some places ask you to stay long enough for their meaning to settle. And Ethan stood there with the key, resting in his palm, its weight simple but steady, as if it belonged there long before he ever touched it. Rex moved quietly beside him, no longer searching, no longer listening for something hidden, but simply present, his posture calm, his breathing even, as though whatever had drawn him here had finally found its place. Walter lingered a few steps back, his eyes moving slowly across the structure one last time, not with uncertainty, but with a quiet sense of completion. like a man who had carried a question for most of his life and had finally seen the answer without needing to ask it out loud. When they made their way back up the stairs, the light from above felt different, not brighter, but clearer, as if the surface world had not changed, but their place within it had. The wind moved gently across the field as they stepped out onto the land again. The same field that had once seemed empty now carried a quiet presence beneath it, something steady, something alive in its own way. Ethan paused for a moment, looking out across the acres, the farmhouse in the distance, the stretch of land that reached farther than he had first realized. And for the first time, he did not see it as something to pass through. He saw it as something to understand, something to care for. Walter stood beside him, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze softer now. "Funny thing about land," he said quietly. "People think they own it, but most of the time, it just lets them stay for a while." Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes still on the horizon, the key resting securely in his hand. Rex sat down beside him, his tail brushing lightly against the ground, his ears relaxed, no longer drawn to a single point, because there was no longer anything hidden that needed to be found, only something that needed to be kept. The wind carried a familiar sound then, faint, almost impossible to hear unless you were listening for it. That same steady rhythm, not from beneath their feet now, but from within the space around them, subtle, patient, unchanged. Ethan took a slow breath, letting the air settle deep in his chest, and in that moment, something inside him grew still in a way it had not in years. Not because everything was understood, but because not everything needed to be. Some things only needed to be respected, protected, and allowed to continue. Walter turned slightly, preparing to head back toward the house, but paused just long enough to speak once more. "You are not here by accident," he said, not as reassurance, but as fact. Ethan did not respond right away, because the truth of that had already taken root, not in words, but in the path that had led him here, in the choices that had not felt like choices at all. Rex stood as Ethan began to walk, staying close at his side, not leading anymore, not guiding, but walking with him. And as they moved across the land together, the distance no longer felt like something to cross. It felt like something to belong to. The farmhouse grew closer, the quiet stretched around them, and the steady rhythm, faint but constant, remained, not as a mystery anymore, but as a reminder that some things continue long after they are forgotten, and sometimes they return not to be uncovered, but to be carried forward by the ones who choose to stay, because he had not come here looking for anything, but somehow, everything that mattered had been waiting for him anyway.